Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to CrossRoads Christian Church, The Passage. Uh, Tonight, as we get into things, or before we get into things, I kind of want to give a word of explanation. Robbie and I were having a conversation, and one of the things is we prepare these, we record them, and we were recording them on Wednesday morning, and then Robbie was basically not getting out of here until later on. Well, actually, right before uh, we launched it at 6 p.m. And so we moved it to Tuesday afternoon. Last week was our first Tuesday afternoon, and yet what I noticed was that Robbie was still here at 3 or 4, maybe later than that, before it launched at 6 p.m. last Wednesday. And so he told me, he said, I kind of have a confession. And he said, part of what is difficult is matching up the slides, the number of slides that you have to the video, and making the boxes and putting the slides in. And so what we decided to do, and not just in fairness to him, because you need to understand him, in making those, it took me some time to lay them out. And so we were just covering ourselves up with this. So this week, I've greatly reduced the number of slides, maybe even to your relief, because I never thought about how overwhelming it might be to those of you who are joining us and who are actually taking notes. And so in this way, you'll catch the major events that we're going to be talking about in our slides. And then anything else, any additional notes that you want to take, feel free as we talk through. Another thing it allows me to do is just to kind of talk about the story rather than reading everything off of the sheet of paper. And so we feel good about this adjustment that we're making. And so just wanted to share that with you. So if the explanation goes from why you don't have 3 or 4 pages now and you're down to 1, you understand why. So tonight we're going to cover a few chapters that have to do with the life of Joseph while he's in Egypt. And it's kind of the beginning stages of his time in Egypt. The point of this is his life is an example of faithful obedience to God. And his obedience is demonstrated by his integrity, his giftedness. He's willing to use the gift that God has given him. He has the ability to dream and to interpret dreams. And so he is using that. And then also his patient trust in the Lord. And that's a lot of what we're going to talk about. And so I've entitled the chapters 39, verse 1 through 41:57. I've entitled this lesson, Potiphar, Prison, Patience, and Providence. And so to get us started, we're going to talk about Potiphar. Chapter 39 is all about Potiphar and Joseph Potiphar and Potiphar's wife. And so verse 1 tells us that the Ishmaelites who bought Joseph from his brothers, they come to Egypt and they sell him to Potiphar, the captain of Pharaoh's guard. And so that's kind of the way that the slave trade worked. The Ishmaelites pick him up for a price. They probably sell him for a profit to Potiphar. And Potiphar is a pretty powerful man. As we said, he's the captain of Pharaoh's guard. And he brings Joseph into his home, probably as a lower level slave at first. But in Potiphar's home, one of the things that you should notice is that Joseph prospers. Verse 2 of chapter 39 says, the Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. All right, and so you not only notice that Joseph prospers, but you also need to notice, just in what's being shared, in the text, uh, Potiphar's uh, is pleased with him. And so you need to notice Joseph's willingness to serve as well. He's accepted this fact that he is there in Egypt, and he has a role, and he takes that role seriously. He, not only because of the the possibility of punishment, but he also takes it seriously because he belongs to the Lord. I mean, and what a reminder for us that in anything that we do, we ought to want to please the Lord, and that's in our roles as husbands and wives, as in our roles as parents, our roles as children to our parents, uh, our job, our work in school, anything that we're volunteering with, that we ought to have this willingness to serve because of who God is, and going in even this next Sunday, I'm talking about this, that it's to God's glory that we live and we serve, and that's what Joseph understood, and so he had this great desire to serve well, and and then notice in just what I read that he is rewarded for his service and obedience. Joseph is elevated to a position. He's called Potiphar's attendant, and it goes on to say that Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything that he owned. Uh, from the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. I mean, again, what a reminder. I mean, for the time that we're living in right now, during during the COVID-19 virus, the social distancing, all of those things that we ought to do our very best um, for the Lord, in order to make His name famous, as we've been talking about, over the course of this year. Um, but also because if we are living the way that we should, we actually bring blessing to the communities in which we live, and that's what's happening with Joseph's life, and so he's elevated. It says the blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So he left in Joseph's care everything he had. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. So Potiphar is just uh, he gives everything over to Joseph and to his control. Now that brings us to Potiphar's wife. Okay, in verse 6, the end of verse 6, we are told this, um, that Joseph is well built and handsome. I told Robbie today I wanted, and he agreed. We want to make sure we put that in the notes because that's an important aspect. He is well built. He's handsome. He's been blessed by God, and the deal with this is Potiphar's wife takes notice, and so Potiphar's wife actually approaches Joseph and tries to seduce him. Okay, I mean, in fact, well, there's no seduction to it really. She just comes out and says, "Come to bed with me." All right, and verse 8 says, "But he refused." He refused, and so there. I mean, notice his integrity. In fact, that's an important part of the story here. Joseph has integrity. He says, "With me in charge, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care." Joseph goes on to say, "There is no one greater in this house than I am." Now, that sounds like he's bragging, but what he's actually doing is taking responsibility. He's showing integrity. He's kind of saying, he's kind of saying, uh, he's trusted me, and he's put me in this position. I haven't earned this position, but rather Potiphar and the Lord have placed me in this position, and I'm not going to take advantage of it. And so he states, my master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. And possibly if Joseph had stopped there, I'm convinced it would have continued, because this is all part of God's providence, and we'll get to that towards the end. But Joseph doesn't stop there. He goes on to confront his wife, Potiphar's wife, and he says, "How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And then it says that she continued day after day to try to convince him to have sexual relations with her. And day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. And so it's one of those things where I think he had such integrity that he even he tried to avoid her, if you will, not run into her. I've shared this story before, but years and years ago, when Jennifer and I were first married. In fact, I think Emily was a child. In fact, I know she was. This was the year before we were preparing to move to Lincoln. I was at St. Louis Christian College for a college graduation. A friend of ours was graduating. And there was a young lady that whenever I was in school at St. Louis, she was in 8th grade, and I was a member of their family group. At St. Louis, we had family groups, and so this young 8th grader, believe it or not, she developed a crush for me, and it kind of furthered that, or not furthered it. I kind of frustrated it, I guess, a little bit. In that, that's not even a word I'm looking for. But I made a mistake in agreeing on Valentine's Day to take a dozen roses to her from her mother, not from me, but that I was the one that delivered them to her junior high. And so here I am as a freshman in college, and I'm walking into this junior high with a dozen roses, and I'm looking for this specific girl, and it's a huge school. And so anyway, that just furthered her crush upon me. And so it had been years since I'd been there. And so we're at this graduation, and I'm walking across the gym afterwards. And this girl screams out to her mother. She says, "Mom, there's Miles." And all of a sudden, this grown girl comes across, throws her arms around me, and I am just, I'm taken back. I mean, I guess that's even minimal for how I really felt. I was a little embarrassed. I was shocked, and she asked me a question, and I won't state the question, but I guess I kind of almost have to. She said, "Where were you when I was ready to get married?" And I remember pushing her away and grabbing Jennifer's hand and pulling her over and saying, "Probably married." I mean, my voice broke, I'm sure. "Probably married to this woman right here," and looking back on it, I may have made a fool out of myself, but that's okay. And that's kind of the example that we get here. Day after day, she is pursuing Joseph, and Joseph, day after day, is even trying to avoid her. And then one day, she caught him by his cloak or his coat, and she said, "Come to bed with me." And he ran right out of his coat. Okay, that's the way that the story goes. He runs. He has such integrity that he doesn't mind that he makes a fool out of himself in front of Potiphar's wife. Now, of course, when her husband gets home, he makes up the story that, or she makes up the story that Joseph attempted to violate her. And unfortunately, in the story, um, well, in fact, she uses the coat as proof. I have his coat. I tore this off of him as he was fleeing from me, which was a little bit of truth. But anyway, Potiphar ends up believing her instead of believing the one that he's trusted. And we don't know exactly how long he's in the household, but it's some time that he serves Potiphar. And part of the point or lesson that I want you to hear in that is, oftentimes the world does not reward moral and ethical behavior. And in this case, it's because Potiphar's wife lied to Potiphar. But we live in that kind of day and age when we're trying to live by God's morality, or by decent, ethics, and sometimes we get attacked for that. And so it should come as no surprise, because that's been the same throughout the Bible. I mean, when you think about it, Jesus, in the time that he was here, he did nothing but good. I mean, nothing but good. What angered the religious people was that he wasn't afraid to tell them the truth. And yet, in telling them the truth, he's still doing good. I mean, always remember that when we share God's truth with others, and I'm not saying we should do it in such a way as if they feel attacked or threatened, but if we stand our ground, sometimes, maybe most times in our world today, we may not be rewarded for that here. But believe me, God sees it, and we are blessed for it. And so that brings us to the section that I've called prison, and that begins in chapter 39, verse 20. It says there that Potiphar throws Joseph in prison. And the prison is the place where the king's prisoners were confined. It must be different from like a pauper's prison or something like that. These were the officials, anyone that they had accused. Then they were confined in this prison. But it says, while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. So once again, Joseph was shown favor by God. In fact, the prison warden notices Joseph, and he puts him in charge of the section of the prison that he is actually serving in or living in. And it's there that Joseph meets Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker in prison. And that begins chapter 40. And so the cupbearer and the baker are in prison. Evidently, one of them has done something. Maybe something came up missing. Maybe there was some suspicion. Whatever it is, both of them are thrown in prison at the same time. And then we're told in verse 5 that as they're being held there in prison, each of these men have a dream one night. They each have a dream. And I just want to read to you the dreams. Actually, they come across Joesph, and Joesph interprets their dreams. And so it's kind of in the same section, the sharing of the dream and then the interpretation. So in verse 9, it says, the chief cupbearer told Joesph his dream. He said to him, in my dream, I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand. This is what it means, Joesph said to him. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. All right, so I want to pause there before verse 14, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Verse 16 says, when the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph, I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. This is what it means, Joseph said. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat away your flesh. Now, I got to tell you, not sure. It goes back when the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation. He said, tell me the meaning of my dream too. I bet he regrets that, or he did regret that. And so verses 20 on tell us that that's exactly what happened. In 3 days, it was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for his officials. And so he brings out the cupbearer and the baker. Cupbearer he restores to his position. The baker he has executed, just as Joseph had interpreted. Now, so each of them had a dream. Joseph interprets their dreams, and then finally Joseph makes a request of the cupbearer, and that takes us back to verse 14, because he's just shared with the cupbearer good news. So in verse 14 he says, when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. And he shares his background a little bit. He says, for I was forcibly carried away from my people, the land of the Hebrews. And even here I've done nothing to deserve to be being in prison. So help me out here. And when you're released, remember me. But sadly, verse 23, and we're going to move into the section that I call patience, Genesis 40:23 through 41:13. Verse 23 says, the chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. I was having a conversation with a couple of different people over the last few days, and what this verse reminded me of is the fact that and it kind of goes back to what I said earlier. The world often does not reward moral and ethical behavior. The world often isn't appreciative, and they don't really remember the goodness of most of God's people. I'm not saying that there are people in the world I know that have had maybe bad experiences with people of the church, but for the most part, people who are part of God's family are loving and serving and devoted people, and they want to, as Paul says, shine like stars, and they want to do good. And sometimes it's made difficult, like when it's not appreciated. And who knows? I mean, the cupbearer may not have done it intentionally. He might have gotten caught up, just caught up in the excitement of the day, the drama of the day, being overwhelmed by being released, and he just simply forgot. But I know that sometimes what we face in life are people who don't thank us, or people who it doesn't seem as if they truly appreciate the love and the help that we give. And yet, that's where patience comes in. Verse 1 of chapter 41 says, when 2 full years had passed. So 2 years go by. When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. Pharaoh had a dream. So 2 years go by, and Pharaoh has dream number 1. I just want to kind of share with you dream number 1. In the dream, he was standing by the Nile River, when out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek, fat cows. And then Pharaoh woke up. I mean, normally dreams like that, I would contribute to bad pepperoni or something, but because that's a weird dream. 7 sleek and fat cows, big, healthy cows, are ate up by 7 ugly and gaunt cows. What can that mean? All right. So then Pharaoh has a second dream. Here's the second dream. He fell asleep again and had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy, full heads. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. And so either in the same night, evidently in the same night, he has 2 dreams. And in the morning, he is really upset. And so he sends for all of his magicians, all of the wise men of Egypt. And he tells them his dreams, but none of them can interpret the dream. And so the chief, or the chief cupbearer in verse 9 says to Pharaoh, "Today I'm reminded of my shortcomings. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants. He imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard." Okay, and so here we're told, it confirms that that the cupbearer says, "I'm reminded of my shortcomings. I remember now because when we were in prison, the baker and I, we both had dreams, and there was one there who interpreted our dreams, and he told me exactly what would happen. He was a young Hebrew, and so he says in verse 13, and things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was hanged." So when no one could interpret the dream, the cupbearer remembered Joseph. And so verse 14 says that Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. I like this. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. He prepares himself to go before, the king of Egypt or Pharaoh. And so patience. 2 years he is in that prison. 2 years he is there for nothing, for a crime he did not commit. Back it up a little bit. He's in Egypt because his brothers were jealous of him. And in all of this, I mean, listen, this is important, because in all of this, in all of the trials that Joseph faces, being, basically sold into slavery by his brothers. How do you deal with that? He's taken by some Ishmaelites to Egypt, and he's sold again into a household where he does well, and then he's falsely accused, and he's placed in prison. He helps a couple of guys out, or at least one of them, and that guy forgets him, and yet Joseph stays true to God. Folks, I think an important lesson there is that with the Christian life, it's not easy, and it's never been promised to be easy. We face trials. We are attacked sometimes. Sometimes maybe we're falsely accused of things, and yet we're to remain faithful. God wants us to trust Him. He wants us to be patient. He will use us in His time. A couple of examples with that. Joseph could be remembering, Lord, don't you remember the dreams I used to have? When is that going to take place? When am I going to? And I'm being careful with this, but please understand the way I'm. When am I going to be used? When am I going to shine? And so I've met people in ministry who are so impatient that they try to force results. I just listened to Kyle Idleman not admit that he was forcing results, but I just listened to him make the comment where he said that there have been times when he was guilty of selling Jesus because he wanted results, instead of truly inviting people to come and follow Jesus. And one of the things that he says, and I think this is things that some of those ministers need to understand, you can't make someone follow Jesus. In fact, Jesus doesn't want anyone to follow Him who does not desire to follow Him. If it's forced or through some sort of guilt or whatever it might be. I mean, Jesus wants disciples. He wants people who are willing, as He said, if you want to follow me, then you need to take up your cross every day and follow me. And again, He throws in there that there will be trials. You got to take up your cross. It means you need to die. You need to die to yourself, and you need to follow me. The second part of that would be those people who maybe they face trials, struggles, and a few of them hit close together. And what happens is they give up. And see, Joseph doesn't do either one of those things. He doesn't get caught up in, Lord, you're not using me like you could, And he doesn't get caught up in the poor me. Look at how much I've suffered, and if I'm going to suffer like this, then I give up, Lord. He continues to be faithful. He continues to be patient. And that's one of the most important lessons in the early days of his life there in Egypt, his patience. And so that brings us to the final part, and that's God's providence. Genesis 41:14 through 57. Verse 14 says that Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. And as I said, he shaved, he prepared himself, he came before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it, but I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. And Joseph says, it must have blown Pharaoh away at first. Joseph says, I can't do it. And then he follows up with, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. You see that? It's kind of the theme of our year, making Jesus famous. Joseph was interested in making God famous. Okay, he wasn't taking any credit for it. This is God's thing, through me. And so Pharaoh explains to Joseph the dreams that he had, the two dreams. And verse 25, chapter 41 says that Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. They mean the same thing. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. And again, just a kind of quick little, lesson here. God often works in that way in people's lives. He will send confirmation uh, through two or three or more, um, you know, vessels. It could be individuals, could be something that you read and that's been on your mind. Then you hear that passage again somewhere, and God is just kind of he's reinforcing that in you, or God has laid on your heart that you need to do something, and then someone comes to you and they confirm to you what God is saying to you, that they agree, that they've seen this is the way God wants to use you, and how you should, the direction that you should go. And so that's what he does in Pharaoh's life. And so Joseph again interprets the dreams. He says they're both one and the same. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterward are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. And so then Joseph says, may Pharaoh look for a good and discerning man who can actually take those first 7 years and store away some of the grain. Store away some of the grain each year, so that when the 7 years of famine hit, we will be able to survive. And this is a worldwide famine. As we're going to see, people come from everywhere to receive food, to basically be saved. And that's why we say this is about the providence of God. He sees it ahead of time. He reveals it to Pharaoh, and then Joseph interprets, and then he puts together a plan in Joseph, because as Joseph said, may Pharaoh find a discerning man. Well, I guess in Pharaoh's opinion, the discerning man's standing right in front of him, and so he elevates Joseph. Get this: Joseph comes in as a kind of a menial slave in Potiphar's house, and now he's being elevated to second in command in Egypt, only to Pharaoh above him. And so Joseph is entrusted, just as Potiphar entrusted him with all the cares of his household, Pharaoh entrusts him with all the cares and concerns of Egypt, especially in this area of how they will provide for those 7 years of famine. And Joseph, he shines in that position. And so verse 41 just shares what I said. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. And he takes his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dresses him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and the men shouted before him, make way. Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. It reminds me a lot of what we just came off of in Esther, how Mordecai was treated towards the end. The king honors him, and here Pharaoh honors Joseph. And if you really get into it, of course, Joseph, as he is honored, he is pointing towards God. Again, some quick lessons as we go through this. There's one Christian artists that I truly respect deeply. Of course, there's more that I respect deeply, but one in particular that I respect deeply because I've heard so many stories about him and they've been through so much. Stephen Curtis Chapman. Uh, he just put out a new song. I listened to it the other day, and it's basically I think it's called Together. And it's along the lines of that we are in this together. We'll get through this together. And of course, it's kind of in some ways it's kind of like the Book of Esther. There's no real mention of God in it, and yet God's all over it because we will get through this together. And it's because it's not just because of the togetherness of the American people. It's not just because of the togetherness of the church. We need more togetherness, by the way, but it's because of our togetherness in relying on God. And one of the things that I remember about Stephen Curtis Chapman so early on is that immediately after his concerts, he would disappear for about a half hour. And there were some people that criticized him for that, because, they were looking for him to be back out there and shaking hands with people. And, didn't he care? Well, I'll tell you how much he cared. He spent that 30 minutes alone with God in prayer. And I don't know. I mean, that's what I feel about like Mordecai and Joesph, Esther, these people, these stories of the Bible, David. Not that David didn't get caught up in some stuff sometimes. And not that, listen, I'm sure Stephen Curtis Chapman got caught up in some stuff sometime. But the humility and the understanding that it's all in God's providence. God's providence is wrapped up in who you are and who I am. It's wrapped up in the gifts that he gives us. They're not really our own. I mean, we get to practice them and develop them, but it's God who's given them to us. And I know that Pharaoh must have recognized that too in Joseph, that as he's elevated to this position, Joseph gives God all the glory. And we're going to see how much that's true, or how true that is next week, because of his response to his brothers. And man, what a statement. I'm kind of going to give this away, but Joseph says to his brothers at one point, what you intended for evil, God meant for good. So don't be distressed. Don't be fearful. Don't be angry. Because, God has put me where he wants me. And so one last thing that I'll share in here is that he marries the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On, and so he marries this Egyptian girl, and they have some kids, and these kids are important for a couple reasons. One, the firstborn is called Manasseh, and he says, "I call him Manasseh because it is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household." He doesn't know that they're going to be coming. What he knows is he's there for a reason. God already has that reason working in him. And then he has one named Ephraim. And Ephraim, that name means it is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. This isn't his home, but it's now his home. He calls it the land of suffering, and he did suffer for quite some time. Potiphar's household, false accusation, being sold into slavery by his brothers, being in prison. He suffered for some time. But now God has made me fruitful, he says. And Manasseh and Ephraim are important because they make up the last two tribes that are recognized in the Promised Land. They each have an inheritance there, Joseph's inheritance there. And so we come to the end, and I'm just going to read verses 56 and 57. When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. And all the countries came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe in all the world. Now, to conclude it, I want to go back and make a statement that I made earlier, just a little bit ago. The conclusion is this: God has Joseph exactly where he wants him. And folks, God hasn't changed. Wherever you are, he has you where he wants you. And so I guess what I want to leave you with is this. I know so many people who are waiting for the days of their future. You know, that when this happens, or when I get to this point, or when I finally pay off the house, whatever. And so many people, when I retire, right? So many people are waiting for that. And I'm telling you, what God wants us to realize is that today is the day that matters. How will we serve today? Will we serve well? Will we serve with integrity? Will we serve with the attitude that even the thank yous that we get, we pass them on to him, because it's to his glory. Again, I'm amazed sometimes just how lesson points kind of connect. And so Sunday, I've been talking about everything is from God. Everything it works through him. And Sunday we'll be talking about everything is to him. So if you're one of those who is kind of waiting, God has you exactly where he wants you, and he wants to use you today. I hope you all are doing well. I hope that this has been helpful. I hope it's been challenging. And so our blessings upon you. We miss you. Man, we miss being together. And I look forward. People have been asking, when are we going to get back together? I'm hoping, man, the first weekend of June. I hope we're back together. But until then, we'll continue to do these kinds of things, and we'll stay connected, even though we're distant from each other. We are in this together. So we love you, and we miss you, and we look forward to seeing you as soon as we can. God bless.